Happy holidays, I hope you're all doing well. Today we are going over one of the most important concepts in competitive Pokemon, passive damage. For those who are unfamiliar with the term because it's hardcore Pokemon player jargon, then fear not. It is also known as indirect damage, first of all, and second of all, it refers to damage that is inflicted on the opponent without the use of a direct attack. Now, if you've ever played Pokemon in any capacity, even just the games, then you know what a direct attack is. Charmander uses Scratch on Squirtle, Squirtle loses HP, that's a direct attack. Use this move, opponent loses HP. And you never bother with those other moves that don't do damage like Growl, it's the first thing you get rid of. Even when you get to the later stages of the game, when you're destroying the Elite Four, you just need attacking moves because they don't switch out. As long as you have some variety in your attacks and know the type chart, then you are going to be fine with your Earthquake and your Thunderbolt and your Ice Beam, Fire Blast, etc. Because the opponent, as strong as their Pokemon will be, they're not going to switch out, so you just use the appropriate move and they go down. Now you go over to competitive Pokemon, and you're not playing the AI anymore. You are playing an opposing human being who knows that their Steel type will not survive a Fire move, and they're going to switch out. And that is the crux of competitive Pokemon battling, because it's all about switching and dealing with the opposing team's damage, and that is where passive damage comes in, because you can't just do the 4 fire move Charizard tactic in online Pokemon, because the opponent will just switch out and switch to a water type every time, and you're not going to get very far. So, and that is where passive damage comes in, because when the opposing team is switching around, then you need some way to combat that, besides just use a stronger attack. I mean, sometimes that works, especially in the newer generations where there's more and more power, but a much more reliable tactic is to become familiar with how passive damage is integrated into every single game you play. You might be thinking, look, I play offense, okay? Those stall players can have their fun with their hazards and their toxic and their leech seed and using Whirlwind to rack up hazard damage, and that's their offensive attack. But come on, I like my Choice Band, my Choice Specs, my high base power moves. I like to see the opposing Pokemon's HP drop immediately, not over the course of 50 million turns. And that's fine, absolutely fine. But that is exactly why I picked this game that I'm about to show you as an example. This game is full of some of the hardest hitters available. It's from Ultra Sun and Moon. And even still, it requires an understanding of how passive damage works to get the most out of them. Even when you are using these big hitters, you still need to be aware of passive damage. Because consider Ubers. You might think, oh my god, these Pokemon are so strong. How don't they just destroy everything? Well, a big part of that is that, yes, they're strong, but Ubers are Pokemon with types like anything else, so they are also vulnerable to things like entry hazards and toxic. Consider the fact that, let's say, Kingdra is just as affected by entry hazards as Palkia. So, those kinds of tactics go a long way in neutralizing the strongest Pokemon in the game. And when you're using these strongest Pokemon in the game, you can't just immediately bulldoze over everything. You have to be aware of these passive damage tactics. So, let's get into this game. So, at first glance, you might think this game is just Zachary has a Specs Tapu Lele, which is one of the worst things for Insult's team to face. So he gets it in, and okay, so here's the first thing. It Psyshocks into Magearna, and wow, that does a ton of damage. And he's just going to bring in Lele over and over and over again. See, there it is again. It's killing stuff, and that's going to happen more and more times. See, every time it comes in, it gets a kill. What's so complicated about this? See, he's spamming his strong move, and the opposing Pokemon are fainting, so he does it over and over and over as much as possible, and eventually, Insult's team is going to crumble. So yeah, at a glance you would think, yeah, come on, just use stronger Pokemon. But it really isn't that simple. So before we analyze this game in depth, specifically the Lele parts, then I want to stress, passive damage on its own doesn't win most games. That is a very unreliable tactic. What passive damage does is it accentuates direct damage. That is a concept we were going to be revisiting throughout this video. We're going to be going over Gens 2 and later, to varying degrees of I'll be extensive to varying degrees because, first of all, my English is failing me because I'm trying to say 6 million things at once, and because there's a lot of generations to cover, especially because I want to provide an example for each one. But the overarching idea is this. No one is saying, all right, my plan is to get up Stealth Rock and then Whirlwind for 600 turns and run out of Whirlwind PP a million times over and kill the opposing team that way. No. What Stealth Rock does is turn already strong Pokemon into absolute monsters. Now, you might think, well, how does that make sense? Because Lele does not need any help. Even with without rocks and spikes, then Specs Tapu Lele is still going to be ripping Insult's team apart, right? Sure, but it's not just about abusing them yourself. It's about being aware of how they are used to keep you in check. Now, remember that thing I said about Palkia being affected by entry hazards? Well, it's the same exact thing here, Tapu Lele. Insult's main way of dealing with it is wearing it down with Stealth Rock. And now, this is another misconception people have about passive damage. They think, look, these are such small increments. I'm just going to out-damage them before they do anything. But again, it's not just passive damage on its own. If Lele had nothing else to worry about but 12.5% from Stealth Rock, then yeah, that would be pretty crazy. But as we're about to see in this game, it's not just dealing with Stealth Rock 12.5% at a time. It's dealing with Stealth Rock in addition to the little hits that it could otherwise take, but doesn't really want to with Stealth Rock in the picture because it's going to get worn down fast, and instead of ripping Insult's entire team apart, it might get 1 or 2 KOs before going down. So it's really crucial to be able to play around this. So let's analyze. So we're not interested in the Torn action. We want Lele in as much as possible, so Lando gets up rocks. That's crucial because even with these Pokemon that largely don't care about it and Torn that can function with it on the field because of Regenerator, Stealth Rock is still important, again, because it accentuates these already dangerous Pokemon. We'll go over the specifics for each generation, but for now, we're just assuming, yeah, Stealth Rock is good. You would rather have Stealth Rock than not have Stealth Rock, if possible. So now here come the rocks, and you might say, oh, well, Lele comes in on Slowbro, and yes, it might come in on Slowbro and eat a Scald and knock, even if it doesn't get burned. That's another source of passive damage, actually, Scald's burn. That's why it's chosen over Surf, even though it's weaker. So even as soon as you start doing that, even, like, if you're playing ORAS and you're using Specs Keldeo, you're going to be using Scald. You're not going to be using Surf because of the power of passive damage. It means, suddenly the opponent is taking damage even when you're not directly attacking it, or on top of you directly attacking it. I mean, like, to use another Slowbro example, again, with the Specs Keldeo, then Slowbro's a decent Specs Keldeo stop, but when it's taking Specs Hydro Pumps in addition to rocks and burn and potentially sand, then it's in trouble. So that's why passive damage is so strong in a nutshell. So anyway, now we see Magearna, yada yada, Volt Switch, and so Torn comes in, and what he's doing here is making very sure Lele, I'm going to spoil it now, he never wants Lele to actually eat an attack from Insult's team. And you might think, well, what sense does that make? Insult is not running an offensive team. These are all very defensive Pokemon. Why does it matter? And, the small damage in conjunction with Stealth Rock, come on, it's not that much. But, 100% goes down quickly when it's 12.5 here, and then 17 here, 20 there, and that goes down real fast. So, that's the primary idea. So, look, now Greninja gets up spikes as Slowbro runs away, and now Lele comes in because Zachary knows that Clefable is almost surely Insult's Stealth Rocker. So, since Stealth Rock is Insult's method of passively wearing Lele down as it comes in, then if he can get it in before rocks even go up, then he's off to a great start. So now Lele is coming in threatening stuff from 100%. So coming in on not an attack, that's number one. And now Clefable just drops to Spec Psychic, so he's got to get out of there. Psyshock does a ton. He's not going to risk it on Magearna. Yeah, Lele could beat this Magearna one-on-one, but that would prevent it from steamrolling Insult's entire team afterwards. So again, got to switch out. He makes a great play here, using Charizard's Stealth Rock weakness. Using Charizard's Stealth Rock weakness as a positive, since it takes so much damage that it nullifies Magearna's Pain Split. And Charizard's weakness to Stealth Rock, again, passive damage. You gotta take it into account. So, with your team, of course. Anyway, so now a double switch. Now, see, that's a great move there because, look, yeah, he could have just played it safe and gone for Roost or Dragon Claw or whatever to try and hit the Slowbro, but that means Lele would have to switch into Slowbro, and again, even if he doesn't get burned by Scald, that means he's actually eating an attack. Now, sitting at 87.5, as he is right now, is hugely different from sitting at, 55, made-up figure from Scald. So, that's oceans and oceans of difference. That's several more Stealth Rock switch-ins, so that's a great play to take the initiative and to play around the passive damage. I mean, you're thinking, come on, Lele is not Stealth Rock weak, and it's not, but it still has to play around it, has to play with it in consideration, and look how much more dangerous it is as a result. See, now it gets a KO, and it's not limited in terms of how many KOs it's going to get. Sorry, mind exploding. It's not limited in terms of its KOs because it needlessly switched into an attack. So that was the benefit of it. It wasn't just switch in strong Pokemon as much as possible, do damage. Yes, it is, but there's a lot more to it than that. So even when you think, look, I'm just spamming my Choice Band, Choice Specs, Dragon Dance, whatever, my attacks, and my opponent's gonna crumple. Yeah, but oftentimes they're like in this example, and there's a lot more to it. So. Yeah, see, getting chased out by Stealth Rock. Now, next time, down at 75. And 75 is still a lot, but again, remember that Lele can't really switch into attacks. I mean, at this point, he's probably at such a decent advantage. Well, not yet. He still wants to get more use out of it. Incidentally, this is why U-Turn and Volt Switch are such good moves, because you get these Pokemon in, and you make sure that they only take the passive damage instead of passive damage and another attack. And that you minimize prediction if they're switching out and you use the switch move. So that's a major part of these, because again, it's not just the passive damage. I mean, if Insult had Rocks and Spikes, then yeah, it would also be the passive damage. You'd have to really make the most out of these turns. And again, Rocks and Spikes would be a great tool in keeping Lele at bay, because you would be ensuring that, defog aside, then it would really be limited in its switch-ins. But at the same time, it still can't take attacks on top of it. Remember, passive damage is not the only source of damage. It serves to accentuate your damaging attacks. Like for example, let's take this Aggron we see on Insult's team. 4-attack Mega Aggron is really hard to switch into, and that's just without rocks. So why wouldn't you want rocks? Because a lot of times to dance around dangerous threats, you're going to have to draw one move and then switch to something else on another. Like in this instance, you might go to Lando. I'm making this up, but Lando on Earthquake, and then you don't want to stand and take an Ice Punch, so you would switch to, let's say, Greninja on the Ice Punch. But you wouldn't want to switch Greninja into Earthquake. And with hazards, then it becomes a lot tougher to do. So. Yes, I think that point is clear. I'm trying to not repeat myself. So, speaking of getting Ice Punch, there's the Rocky Helmet. More chip damage. Look, that's why Rocky Helmet is such an incredible move. Because now, even if you do damage, that's why in ORAS, to use another ORAS example, people are so cavalier about sending in their tank Garchomp into Mega Metachams and Mega Metagrosses, because they take so much damage. Even if the Garchomp goes down, then it's doing so much to Metagross and Metacham in return that it's worth it. So anyway, now we have so Rocky Helmet. Look at how much chip that is. Rocky Helmet is a ton. Even without an accentuating Rough Skin or Iron Barbs to accompany it. So now U-Turn, and again now Greninja's coming in because it's faster than Torn. But again, more chip damage everywhere. And now, look, another great switch, double switch to Lele on either the Gastro or the Clef. So again, you don't want Lele. Look, once again, that Lele has not actually been hit by an attack. And there are a lot of cases of players playing around dangerous threats without actually ever being able to hit them with an attack, because the opponent won't let them do it. And they are forced to resort to passive damage to do so. And that's why passive damage is crucial, because it helps keep these huge threats in line. It gives you room to play around them. And again, you don't want to be switching into Gastrodon or Clef with Lele. and nothing else really switches into them confidently. So Sakura is really he's playing great. He's really making the most out of this monstrous threat, because if he switches it into an attack, then there it goes, and he doesn't want to have to sacrifice a Pokemon to be able to switch it in safely. So take the initiative, limit the opponent's room for outplaying it by outplaying yourself first. So again, preserve it, and now he does it again. Well, now he's up enough to where he doesn't mind sacrificing to get it in. So U-turn, yada yada. If he recovers, then Lando can threaten with knockoff or toxic or something. And now here comes Lele again. Still hasn't been touched by an attack and gets another KO as a result. So, if it had taken like even a Moonblast or something earlier from Clef, then this is a different story. It's probably on its last legs. And yeah, it still would have been doing a ton, but who knows? Insult would have more room to potentially double switch to Torn and threaten it out, more rocks damage, etc. So point more or less made at this point. So now he just sacks and gets it in again. It's Charizard to sack now just to bring Lele in, and down goes that. So once again, so now Lele's at 50 just from Stealth Rock damage, and that's because of the way Sakura's played. Even though, yeah, Tapu Lele kills everything on Insult's team, it's just ridiculously strong, etc. Even though that is the case, then he still has to play with the passive damage in mind. So once again, I will emphasize that even when you are dealing with these incredibly strong Pokemon, when you're trying to spam your Spec Psychics till the cows come home, then you still need to keep these things in mind. If he hadn't played the way he did, then Lele doesn't get as far as it does, and he might not win this game, because even after all this, then Insult is barely in it. So margin of error was very thin there. So anyway, once again, Sakura is forced to sacrifice something, and doesn't really matter, etc. And yeah, now he just goes to Greninja and finishes this thing off because of a crit. But he had it with Lele anyway, I think. But point being, I think the example was illustrated well enough with the Lele maneuver. So great job to Sakura. Anyway, now we are going to go through each generation, briefly, some particularly relevant examples of how passive damage interactions affect various Pokemon interactions in the metagame. So after each generation, then I'm going to refer to the SPL replay thread, which if you watch my videos regularly, you should be well acquainted with by now. And if you're not, then on the screen right now, you see how to get it. Go to the Smogon forums and then follow these trains, and you will find it, and then you will find this thread. Alternatively, join my Discord server. There's a link in the resources channel there, and it's a great place to hang out in general. And the link to that Discord server is in the description. So, all right. So what I'll be doing after every generational example is I'm going to go to the SPL finals here, and I'm going to show the game they had. So it's not cherry picked to show a certain result or something. And I'm just going to illustrate how passive damage affects everything. Post RBY. Part of the reason RBY is so tough to get acclimated to for newer players is because there's no passive damage. Toxic and Leech Seed are really bad in it. They're not worth using. So it's just positioning yourself in direct damage and switching around that direct damage. So, and whereas in later gens, then passive damage affects nearly everything. So anyway, we'll start with GSC because that's where passive damage really takes off. Because first of all, Toxic becomes more useful, but that's mostly because of spikes. Spikes, and as a result of spikes, then phasing moves become useful also to deal with Curse Snorlax, which is defining. But spikes, Toxic, Leech Seed is still not very good, but Toxic is good, especially because in Gen 2, then as soon as you switch in, the Toxic damage takes place. So what that means is, let's assume, I realize that I'm going to be speaking in pretty abstract terms here while I'm doing my whole podcast freestyling thing, So that's why I wanted to give an example after each generation, because I realized that, this makes sense to me and other super experienced Pokemon players, but for someone who's less experienced in the competitive scene, then I may as well be, speaking an alien language. So, now, let me give an example. So, let's say my Snorlax is poisoned, toxic. It reverts to regular poison when you switch out. And that's actually better because regular poison immediately does more damage. So, Snorlax is poisoned, and I want to switch it into Raikou. So, I switch it into Raikou, I take the poison damage, and then Raikou uses Roar. Now, in later generations, poison happens at the end of the turn. So, if I switch Snorlax into Raikou and it uses Roar, I don't take any poison damage. But in GSC, I do take poison damage as soon as I switch in. So you pair it with spikes, and you can do 25% per switch in. And paired with a phaser like Roar Raikou, that's really dangerous. Raikou has great matchups against a lot of the tier. So you get a Roar chain going. You threaten Pokemon out over and over, drag others in, weaken them, etc. So that's major. So, of course, Cloyster is one of the two really good spikers. Cloyster and Fortress both get spin, although Cloyster cannot use spin and explosion, so generally uses explosion. And if you want rapid spin, then you'll generally go with Golem, which also has explosion and can use it on the same set as rapid spin. Uses Roar to phase Snorlax, so it's basically spikes, toxic, phasing moves, and there are some really crucial examples of how common interactions in the metagame, because these are smaller metagames, the earlier generations, so you can zero in on interactions that you're going to be encountering on a near game-to-game basis. I mean, every metagame has its popular Pokemon, but it's not as insular, let's say, as GSC. So we already went over the Raikou example. That's one of the most important. For stall teams that can't hurt Raikou outside of their own Snorlax very often, then they really have a tough time against Roar because they're constantly afraid of their Skarmory or Weakened Fortress or Suicune, etc. Getting thundered to oblivion, so they want to keep going to their own Raikou, their Snorlax, and they keep getting roared around. And when paired with Toxic, it can get really ugly really fast. So now, an even more common example for offense, because yes, GSC does have offense. Now, a lot of people think, look, GSC is the stall generation. It's just, get up your one layer of spikes and maybe Toxic and then switch between your Pokemon for 1,000 turns. Nonsense. GSC has a ton. I actually have a video dedicated to why GSC is not stall and why offense is really good, if you're more interested in the subject. But the idea that GSC is all stall is just blatantly wrong. Like, anyone who says GSC is all stall reveals that they don't know what they're talking about. End of story. It's really not up for debate. So, if you'd like to debate it, then please come on Discord and debate it. But, just know that, anyone who's experienced in GSC will disagree with you. So, point being, there are lots of offensive threats in GSC. Snorlax is a big one. Makes everything more annoying to deal with. The thing with Snorlax is that one of its main counters is Skarmory. Even when passive damage doesn't directly affect a Pokemon, that in itself is a virtue. Like, Zapdos and Skarmory are in part so annoying because they are not hit by spikes. That makes them so much harder to deal with. Like, for example, Machamp is not a great spikes abuser per se, because when it's getting checked by Skarmory and Zapdos, then, it doesn't matter if there are a million layers of spikes on the field. They're still not taking any damage from them. Same with Snorlax if it's walled by Skarmory. But if Snorlax is running a fire move or thunder, then it's not walled by Skarmory, and a rock type or a ghost type will come in and ignore the fact that there are abilities here. There are no abilities in GSC. That's just a showdown default. So, don't get any ideas like, what about Levitate, Gengar, and Misdreavus? No, they take spikes damage. It's weird to see Gengar weak to spikes in Earthquake, but yeah. Pre-Gen 7, that is. Anyway, so in that case, then you are forcing yourself to not be weak to the spikes immune Pokemon, and making sure that the passive damage can make up for that weakness. So that's a big reason why Firelax, as it's often referred to, is so popular. Because it's walled by T-Tar and Rhydon, but those guys get worn down by spikes. And again, it doesn't matter as much that Flamethrower does 2% to them. It does a little more, but after lefties, and it matters more that they're taking spikes. So that allows you to make good switches, to pressure them more. It's 6.25% at a time because leftovers heals half of the 12.5 off. but at the same time, it gives you something to do against them, as opposed to EQ lax against Skarmory, where you're just like, well, I can double switch on the Skarmory all day, but I'm going to be weakening Skarmory's teammates. When you have Zapdos, this is a classic example, Snorlax plus Zapdos against Raikou plus Skarmory. You could double switch Zapdos into Skarmory all day, but you're weakening the Raikou with spikes, not the Snorlax. Or not the Skarmory, sorry. So you have to zero in on the Raikou being weakened, because it doesn't matter that Raikou rests, because, first of all, your Snorlax is probably also taking spikes, so you really can't switch forever. And Raikou resting, it's going to wall zap anyway, and you haven't done anything to get the real issue, Skarmory, out of the way. So you have to have something else that abuses a sleeping Raikou, like Vaporeon, for example. So, and again, I realize I'm going to give examples here, but if you want to visualize these kind of abstract concepts more, then I encourage you to look into these replays yourself. Threads like these, all the tournament replay threads, and think about what I'm saying in this video, and really watch these games and notice how passive damage affects so many aspects of them. Learning on your own, it'll really help you understand it more. So, now another classic example is Snorlax coming into Zapdos. So let's examine the damage calculator. One of your best friends, I made a video about that as well. So, this not great chance to 4-hit KO. Look, without spikes, Snorlax will switch into this Thunder more or less all day, especially because it's 70% accurate. But with spikes, guaranteed 4-hit KO, that what that means is that Snorlax has a hard time mustering offense in return. Thunder, especially, that's because this is assuming it comes in at absolute full health. So what happens is that Zapdos can pop a couple Thunders on Lax with spikes down, and that little extra push is enough to force it to rest like almost immediately. So and that is where you take advantage of it. You send in your Machamp, for example, to give the most offensive example, let's say. So you send in your Machamp because the Snorlax has been forced to rest, and it's been forced to rest because it took more damage from spikes. And that's why passive damage is such a big deal. It sticks. I mean, unless forcibly removed, of course, and that's where GSC is often slow-paced enough to where you can afford to play the spikes game. But I mean, even offensive teams play the spikes game effectively because Fortress is good to fit on them. Golem is obviously amazing. So, dealing with passive damage is huge. I mean, that's why defensive teams sometimes they like Blissey, because they want Heal Bell. They want to be able to rest stuff off without the repercussions of that, and they want to be able to deal with Toxic better. A great example is last SPL, Fear, who is the best GSCer. You can't rank him any lower than like top 3, maybe top 2, really, of the past several years. He had this whole thing where he was like, look, I can't spam rest. It's too easily taken advantage of, and that made him more vulnerable to passive damage. That's another reason why so many forms of passive damage are so nasty, because they stick, or they are there unless you actively move against them. So let's take Leech Seed, for example, because that's impermanent, you say. You just switch out. Well, I mean, if you're forced to switch out, that's pretty good. That's a better position for you later. You get to get a switch that you're really looking for. And in conjunction with spikes, that's really nice. I mean, forcing the opponent to switch, that's what you want. I mean, Leech Seed on its own is not going to win games, but Leech Seed in conjunction with other attacks, other sources of passive damage, good switching, then yes, absolutely, it can be a great tool in winning games. So, the example I'm thinking of is where Fear not running Rest on a Zapdos made him vulnerable to Toxic. Usually, if Skarm Toxic Zapdos, it's a minor inconvenience, but when you're not running Rest, then you become more vulnerable to Toxic. Again, and of course, Leech Seed was the impermanent example of that. Spikes and things like Poison and Burn, then they're there to stay. Or even when you take like that little bit of damage, that Leech Seed, or in newer gens, that Rough Skin, Rocky Helmet, Iron Barbs, unless you are recovering that off in some way, that sticks. Whether it be leftovers or your ability. I mean, with leftovers, then that's your item slot used for situations like that. or you use a recovery move. In order to offset this damage, then you need to move against it in some way. And this is part of why people really don't like Regenerator, because you don't have to use your, you don't give up an ability for it most of the time, unless you're running Reuniclus or something. But, things like Toxapex and Tornadus and Tangrowth, you just run Regenerator. Now you can run whatever item, whatever moves you want, and you're still going to be healing because of it. But, in other, outside of Regenerator, then you need a move or an item to heal off that passive damage. And again, passive damage, for the most part, it applies to everything. And look, there are exceptions, of course, like Steel and Poison types don't take Toxic, Fire types don't take Burn, Grass types don't take Leech Seed, and in Gen 2 and 3, then Flying types and Levitators in Gen 3 don't take Spikes, but, that's still a vast majority of Pokemon that are affected by these. I mean, let's look at Spikes in GSC. The OU Pokemon that are affected by them is, everything besides Skarmory and Zapdos. I mean, even if you dip into BL, the Pokemon that are actually used, I mean, you have the very rare Articuno, the occasional Charizard, the rare Dragonite, and so there are just a lot of Pokemon that are affected by spikes. Very often you are getting, at least 4 Pokemon, and very often 5, and crucial Pokemon too. So Spikes is big, Toxic is big. I mean, Fortress, Gengar, Nidoking. And the big thing about Toxic is actually that the Toxic users, it's not like, if you don't want to get hit with Toxic, just switch to your Steel or Poison type. Because let's say a prime Toxic user is Toxic Snorlax, and Toxic Lax runs Flamethrower. So with Flamethrower, you will blow past the Steel types, and the Poison types don't really want to deal with you regardless. So you are reliably able to spread a Toxic onto that Tyranitar, or that Rhydon, or whatever they're using to check that bulky Suicune, forcing a rest if they're running a Stallish team, Umbreon, that kind of thing. So you can very easily adjust your moveset to make the most out of such passive damage. So that's been the GSC rundown. So I'll stop there before I really get into a full-scale analysis of the tier itself. I mean, there are things like Roar, T-Tar, chipping. Things like Raikou and Snorlax, and just every. I mean, at this point, I'm going to refrain from trying to turn this into a tier guide, like I said. But again, every aspect of this, Exeggutor switching into Zapdos, HP Ice, that's affected by spikes, and Fortress, Gengar, Heracross. Part of Heracross's problem is that its counters are Skarmory and Zapdos, so spikes don't do anything for it, and they heal off its Seismic Tosses, which is its best way to damage them. They heal off its Seismic Tosses easily because it's not Seismic Toss and that damage sticks. No, they have leftovers and they don't take spikes. Compared to something like a T-Tar, which switches into a Fire Lax, yeah, it resists Snorlax's moves, but it takes spikes on top of it. So even if Snorlax just hits it feebly with a return or something, then the T-Tar is still chipped. And that goes for Snorlax switching into all sorts of attacks as well. So let's go to the example. So this is Kratos Mana, otherwise known as Anti versus Friend of Mr. Golem. We're not going to do another full-scale analysis because this video is long as is. But, passive damage everywhere. So, alright, here's a big one. The lack of Leftovers recovery means that this Zapdos is a lot more susceptible to passive damage. If it gets hit with Toxic, it's going to be forced to rest sooner. If it gets hit with a Heracross Seismic Toss, same deal. It's a lot more vulnerable. So, the counterpart to passive damage is, of course, passive healing. So, Leftovers, Regenerator, as mentioned earlier. And in part, this is why Clefable is so potent in Gens 4, 6, 7, 8. Because it passively heals, even in the face of all the passive damage. And its counters, and this applies to something like Reuniclus as well, they are immune to the passive damage, and they passively heal with Leftovers, and they instantly heal as well. So, a combination of both is generally the best. And their counters are not so lucky. Things like Heatran get worn down when switching into Clefable because they eat hazards. And, then you just outlast them as long as you have a decent enough defensive backbone, which is not a whole lot to ask for. So, anyway, so that's that. Now, Lax, Zapdos. Notice how this, Zapdos should not be switching into Snorlax like this. That was, but Okay, I'm gonna stop saying a million things at once. So yeah, the spikes. Now look what the spikes do. Now the spikes make Snorlax have a rougher time switching into Zapdos. Wear down T-Tar. You know, you roar in T-Tar at low health, and it's basically already dead. You could potentially roar at this health. You could potentially roar T-Tar in over and over again if you've got a roar poke, and you know you might just KO it. So now Quagsire, HP Rock. Now Fortress, and one of the things that's cool about Fortress is, well, first of all, it's toxic immunity. So you've got your 2 toxic immunities here. Not that they're good against toxic Snorlax, for example, but you know it's preferable to Cloyster getting toxic by something like a Skarmory. So it gives you longevity in the stall matchup, and also the fact that Fortress can spin as well as Boom due to moveset legality. So now stuff happens. Nidoking is really great with spikes and not very good without spikes. So that's an example. And like the absence of passive damage, you know, when you miss a toxic on something like Zapdos, then you really notice it, because you know, you would think, man, if that Zapdos was getting worn down right now, that would be really helpful. Really, it would be much better than it not being poisoned. I mean, it seems very obvious, but you know, it just goes to show just how strong this stuff is. So now Growl. And, you know, a very unfortunate crit. He's Thunder, more Toxmist. That's not really the point of this video. This Lax was really going berserk. But, point being that... oh, another Thief. Yeah. So, look at that. Look at this. Like, this Zapdos is Thunderbolt, not even Thunder. And look at how pressured Lax is already. I mean, if it was Thunder, it would be on the verge of death at this point. But, you know, with this, he's able to curse and then... But he has to rest. And just imagine that was Thunder, and he was really, you know, in a bind. So, yeah, there's that. And passive damage, Quagsire gets thieved, loses its passive recovery. I mean, Zapdos is dead, so it doesn't really matter. And now the passive damage is less important, so we're gonna skip through to the end and move on to Gen 3. Now, more stuff happens, you know, hacks, etc. Anyway, so let's move on to Gen 3. Now, Gen 3 is where passive damage gets good. I mean, you still have flying types immune to spikes, but the thing to consider here is that Leech Seed is really good, and Will-O-Wisp is a move now, and Toxic is much better, and... yeah, so, and of course, the biggest one, Permanent Sandstorm. Now, I'm not going to, again, I don't want to go into a full-scale analysis of the tier. You know, I have a video dedicated to why Tyranitar and its Sandstorm are so big for advanced, but point being, look, passive damage is huge here. So you've got your, and like just some of the relevant interactions in the tier. I mean, Spikes also now goes up to 3 layers. I didn't even mention that. So you are able to, whereas in GSC you really had to work to make your passive damage go together. I mean, you have your, you have to spike, and then you have to toxic the right thing, and then you have to get yourself in a position to roar. I mean, you know, you lead off with T-Tar, then you switch to Skarmory on the Metagross, and you lay up a spike, and you are instantly already pressuring so much with the spike and sand. You know, very few things are immune to both, and you know, a lot of good Pokemon are affected by at least one. That's the same thing. I meant to say if they're affected by both. So, you know, something like Suicune loses a lot of effectiveness with, you know, very little effort. So their passive damage now becomes incredibly powerful. Now, at the same time, you still cannot have a really good team that only relies on passive damage. I mean, the standard team is, you know, yeah, T-Tar, Skarmory, Gengar, Swampert. But, you know, first of all, Tyranitar is a threat on its own, Gengar is a threat on its own, and then that last Pokemon should be a threat on its own. Aerodactyl and Starmie and Moltres are the most common. So, you know, they dish out damage. And something like a Starmie is a lot less, I mean, still good. You know, something like Moltres too, and Arrow, they're good without spikes and not so much without sand. A lot of offensive Pokemon really need sand to be functional in advance. So again, passive damage is incredibly key here. But, you know, with the spikes, and they just get pushed into another dimension. And they go from being, you know, irritating to, oh my god, I can't switch into this thing. So, Passive damage is also key because now we have strong choice banders, and that is imperative to make sure they don't run you over. So something like a choice band Salamence, if it wasn't affected by sand, that would be horrifying, because otherwise, permanent sand means that if you're sand weak and don't have leftovers, i.e. item slot, i.e. crucial, because you want other items. I mean, a mixed Salamence would love to run like Black Belt, but it can't, because then it dies to sand in 16 turns. And you don't think that's a lot, but, it has to switch in, and then it has to deal with things like getting switched around and dealing with Protect. And so, yeah, it goes by really, really fast. Timer, fast-ticking timer. That's why the lack of permanent sand was such a... made, these breakers so much more difficult to deal with, starting in Gen 6. Because now something like a Specs Keldeo, doesn't have to deal with sand all game. It'll just switch in all year long and, barrage you with attacks you cannot withstand forever. I mean, of course, there's a flip side to the fact that you don't need to deal with sand while you try to counter it, but I think it's outweighed by not having it to chip things like that, and your Mega Metacham and Mega Lopunny. So things of that nature. Of course, that would make things like Clefable and Steel types like Mega Metagross even better. But we'll get there. And I didn't think I was going to need a bathroom break because I decided to drop a Draco before I started this video. But I like to stay hydrated. I drink a lot of water, and that means I will be back in Flash. So enjoy the music. I hope you are enjoying this podcast. One of my goals for 2021 is to start getting these things up on Spotify, as has been requested, so I hear you. Anyway, BRB. Alright, nothing like some good cleansing of your bodily fluids. One guy in the comments was like, can you take us to the bathroom when you go on these pee breaks? And the answer is unfortunately no, because I'm afraid. Anyway, so speaking of, peeing all over the metagame, that was, yeah. So, something like Gengar, makes ignore the cursed body thing. It got Levitate pre-Gen 7. That's just the showdown thing. So, yeah, without getting into a full-scale treatise, that's one of those words I've only ever read and haven't heard spoken out loud, so I don't know how to pronounce it, if it's treatise or treatise. Regardless, passive damage affects everything. So, the thing about keeping big hitters in check. So something like Heracross, in fact, is massively dangerous, and I went over this in my video about the fighters of Advance. Part of the reason why they're not as successful is because they really, really hate sand and spikes. They're already fairly frail, and it's not just if they only had to deal with sand and spikes, that'd be one thing, but the fact that sand and spikes accelerates them, how quickly they go down to other attacks. Once again, it's passive damage plus direct damage. That's the threat, not just one of either. That those two in conjunction with switching is, in a sense that is very much all of what competitive Pokemon is about. So, yeah. Now we have post RBY. Anyway, so I'll let you do your further outside research on why, because we have more generations to cover, on how passive damage affects these Pokemon in particular. I think most of it is fairly evident, with things like spikes and sand, but also toxic and leech seed and phasing moves and whatnot. So we'll just go to our example. So how does this SPL Finals game get affected by passive damage? Because once again, every single one in some way. So there's the sand, and that automatically means, look, yeah, you got to run leftovers in advance on sand weak Pokemon, or else they will just struggle. And you can see this in things like why knockoff is good. I have a video about that too. I'm shouting out all my other videos because I recently came into some new subscribers thanks to my second feature on False Swipe Gaming. So I want to give you guys some more videos to go look up, because I am here to ramble your ears off about the intricacies of high-level Pokemon. Anyway, now we go to get my dimensions fixed. Yeah, so we see two Pokemon that are affected by sand and spikes already. So, you can't just ignore these. You have to account for them with your team building, your playing, something. So, look, passive damage already. That's why Natural Cure is so... Milotic runs Refresh because it gets hit with Toxic so much. Celebi has Natural Cure. That's part of why it's so great, because it deals with status. And, so it doesn't get permanently crippled by Toxic and Will-O-Wisp. That's another reason why Blissey is so good, in particular. And now here comes Skarm, the king of passive damage. Doesn't want to deal with Gengar, it's Will-O-Wisp. So there's more Celebi status absorption, Celebi Leech Seed blocking from Celebi. So another Leech Seed, now another Will-O-Wisp. So, another Skarmory. So, yeah, there are very offensive teams in advance as well. Again, not cherry-picked, but, passive damage is very, prominent, very strong. So, there's Claydol, whose Rapid Spin leaves it trying to get rid of the passive damage, or one source of it at least, while it's immunity to Sandstorm. Claydol, in a sense, is really the ultimate anti-passive damage poke, because not only is it immune to sand and spikes itself, because things like Flygon and Arrow and Skarm also boast that quality, but Claydol also tries to actively get rid of spikes for its teammates via Rapid Spin. And for a long time it ran Refresh to get its rid of status as well, before people realized that set was passive and bad. Anyway, so now look at how spikes, with multi-layers, even just one layer of spikes here, but look, resisted attack. Now without spikes, this Jirachi takes nothing from that Gengar Ice Punch. And you might think, yeah, okay, it's still not taking that much from this Gengar Ice Punch, even with the spikes down. But over the course of the game, those little percents, they certainly add up, especially because it's going to have to step on spikes again the next time it comes in. And a lot of Pokemon, their EV spreads are built to, withstand hits from a certain threshold, and that threshold usually, assumes, healthy or very close to it, and spikes mess that up. That's part of why Claydol is here on this team, and has Wish to further offset such passive... Oh, I thought this was a Wish Jirachi. It's Sub. My bad. So, yeah, passive damage, it's everywhere, as we can see. So we're going to skip through because it's everywhere. There's Recover to offset it. So there's some direct damage. Direct. But, look, again, like Spikes, it steps on that T-Bolt, and, it's in danger range of... Ice Punch. So now switching into this, Flamethrower is even more difficult, even with the Claydol or with the Milotic, because it's getting worn down. This is why spikes are so good. So, and now Milotic is chipped again with that double switch with spikes up. When you have hazards up in particular, and status of course can be stacked with it, then just switching becomes an offensive move as well. Not just in terms of positioning yourself to get your big hitter in, but because you are forcing the opponent to switch around more. And with hazards, then you in a sense, are still directly playing offense with your indirect damage, because they're switching around and they're still taking damage even when you're not attacking. It's also why in later gens, then you get rocks and a bunch of spikes up, and like a phasing move becomes a pretty powerful offensive attack because you're doing 30-40% to stuff. So. Depending. Now, Gengar has to come in on... no, this is not really important. Tama doesn't have any spikes, and that's really set him behind. He's outmatched in the spike. Gengar and Moltres are immune to spikes, and he was trying to catch either of them. You're probably Gengar with that. But, spikes also serve to wear down the Swampert, the Celebi, the T-Tar. he's getting all 3 layers down. He's willing to try and get rid of them all himself, but he's falling behind. So again, spikes, dangerous. And so yeah, the passive damage huge. Now Gen 4. How to adjust the dimensions once again without making them smaller. So Gen 4. Now we have Stealth Rock, which is of course hitting everything, literally everything that isn't a Magic Guard Pokemon. Even now we have quadruple Stealth Rock resistant Pokemon, just Lucario. But even there, Stealth Rock is relevant. First of all, because Focus Sash is introduced, so you can't just sash Lucario and live out anything. Not that you could with spikes, or that it would be good anyway, but that's one thing. But even the 3.125% is big, because a lot of defensive moves are a roll on Lucario. It's just bulky enough to survive things like Zapdos Heat Wave from full, and Jirachi Fire Punch. Even Gliscor Earthquake is a roll. Look it up. It's a very good roll, but with Stealth Rock, it's a done deal. And without, then there's that small chance. Anyway, so things like that. Even against the Pokemon that really should not care about rocks, it still does. Still is a relevant factor to consider. So Stealth Rock is big. You have your Stealth Rock leads, of course, getting them as soon as you can. A lot of Stealth Rock is on every team. Before Spikes was optional in advance. You could make a case for it being mandatory outside of like Baton Pass stuff in Gen 2, but in Gen 4 you got to run rocks. So, and that affects so much. Stealth Rock weak Pokemon are at a disadvantage. Stealth Rock resistant Pokemon are at an advantage. So that's why in scenarios like Breloom versus Zapdos, Zapdos counters Breloom, but it's weak to rocks, whereas Breloom resists rocks and heals in sand, thanks to Poison Heal and Toxic Orb. So again, passive damage and its counterpart, passive recovery, are massive here. So you can see how that situation quickly, one switch with rocks and sand up, and Zapdos is sitting at 50% the next time it tries to come into Breloom, while Breloom isn't getting worn down at all without spikes also in the picture. So it's major. And now a defensive Pokemon is, and before we had how well does it deal with spikes and sand, but that could be compensated for with good team play. But typing is always a big part of a defensive Pokemon's utility. But now it's more important than ever, because Gyarados would be an incredible defensive Pokemon without Stealth Rock, but Stealth Rock exists, so it's not very good. So, and whereas things like Hippowdon and Swampert are reliable defensively because they resist rock. Of course, you can make these pairings of the direct damage plus passive damage. You have something like Breloom or Lucario or Infernape. Pokemon... Well, actually, Infernape's a bad example because it's famously one of the most vulnerable Pokemon to passive damage. People run Leftovers Infernape just because otherwise sand wears it down too quickly, in conjunction with hazards. Life Orb Infernape, dies quicker than any other Pokemon, as dangerous as it is. So, the whole point being, you combine something that is resilient in the face of all this passive damage that is thrown around. It's not like this passive damage requires a lot of setup either. You send in Hippo or T-Tar, and there goes sand, and you get up rocks with one of the million things that get rocks, and there they are, unless they get spun, and of course, spinning is not that easy in DPP, even if you use Starmie. And it's not that difficult to block either, or get rid of the spinner, etc. So basically you have to deal with rocks. So when you pair a Pokemon that's resistant to rocks and sand like Breloom, and has counters that are many counters, like Zapdos being the biggest example, that are vulnerable to rocks and sand, then you have a really nasty offensive combination on your hands. So, and that's why like Mixed Knight is really good, but it gets held back just because of how vulnerable it is to passive damage. Because in addition to being weak to rocks and sand, it also has to use Life Orb, so it gets it's hard to make use of, and that's why things like Gliscor and Clefable are so good, because they are so resilient. Clefable's immune to everything. Without magic, the passive damage thing is summed up in the power of Magic Guard, because Clefable's stats are not all that. Otherwise it would just be completely outclassed by Blissey, even though it has Knockoff. Knockoff is also good not just because getting rid of items is good, but because in conjunction with passive damage, it's really nasty. I mean, getting rid of lefties in addition to sand and toxic spikes, will-o-wisps, it's really, really brutal. And why does Heatran run Lava Plume over Flamethrower on so many sets? Burn chance, passive damage. So, runs Roar a lot. Skarmory, of course, is Skarm. And what was the point I was originally making about... Oh yeah, Clef, Magic Guard. I mean, the fact that passive damage is so key that this UU Pokemon has come to completely dominate several half of the generations of OU because of it. So you put Magic Guard Clef in advance and it would be astonishing. So even if you didn't give a knockoff, that would be just too much. But if you did, even without knockoff, it'd be crazy. So. Yeah, Clef sums it up really, really well. And you know what? Rather than just keep going on about everything I've gone over, and again, on my channel and in my Discord server are plenty of resources for further reading if you want to learn more about the intricacies of these tiers. And from there, you can watch these games and analyze how passive damage influences them yourself. Like, you can go to the same thread and look at the semis games and the week 9 and 8 games and so on. But we're sticking with the finals games. So this is from when Doug Trio was still in the tier. And right now, is my thing still... Okay, I'm fast forwarding just so YouTube knows I'm still watching. This is from a playlist on my channel called Background Music. It's publicly available if you want to go find something that you hear in this video. Anyway, back to here. So, again, we're not interested so much in the battle itself as much as passive damage everywhere. So, oh yeah, so Jirachi's a great lead, one of the best. So there's rocks, and now they're there unless Emerald actively spins them away. So, and that requires a Pokemon slot, and those Pokemon are not the easiest to fit. So very often turn 1 rocks are permanent rocks. So can't possibly have rocks any quicker than turn 1. And that's why so many players try to do so. And it's hard to prevent them from going up, because just generally good Pokemon use them. Anyway, so obviously the moves that run passive damage have a multifaceted purpose. Like, Rotom doesn't just run Will-O-Wisp to spread passive damage, otherwise it'd just run Toxic, but also because it cripples T-Tar and makes it harder to pursue. So things like that. And Toxic T-Tar is a great Pokemon because it wears down things like Hippo, Swampert, Gliscor that would otherwise really sit on it. So, once again, of course, Sand is also incredibly crucial. I mean, look at how it stacks with Toxic, for example. So, yeah, now rocks go up, and rocks are likely permanent on both sides now. And that's why I like leading with Stealth Rock T-Tar so much, because you can, you have Sand running before turn 1 even starts, and then you have rocks right from the beginning of the game. So, you can't possibly have more passive damage against a wider variety of Pokemon than that. I mean, you can get up spikes and T-spikes on the first turn, but can't pair that with Sand, and they don't hit everything the way rocks do. So, anyway, sorry I got distracted by a message. And another point I wanted to make is that Emerald has Gliscor and Clefable here, and Gliscor and Clefable are famous for having checks that are worn down by passive damage before they do. I mean, Gliscor's not immune. I mean, it doesn't have Poison Heal in Gen 4, so it has to rely on leftovers, but at the same time, everything else gets hit by Sand and spikes, and Gliscor just kind of sits on them, especially because of Roost. It's the immune and is not weak to Stealth Rock. So a lot of really, really good qualities. Sand immunity, Spikes immunity, Rocks neutrality, Clefable immunity, everything. Instant recovery on both, so you got a lot of longevity here. So, and knockoff, to speed up the opponents. I mean, if that was a leftovers Latias, that would be more relevant. But at the same time, it's just a good move, getting rid of hazards. And now it gets a Scarf back by tricking it from Magnezone. That's funny. Anyway, stuff happens. Clef comes in, knocks off Rotom lefties. That's big. I mean, there are certain cases where Clef is permanently walled by this Rotom besides knock, but doesn't have infinite rests. So, and Clef doesn't have infinite PP either, but it has a lot, so stuff happened. Anyway, passive damage, knockoff, Jirachi doesn't passively heal anymore, Doug, knockoff, Screech, that's what one of the things Doug did, Screech just for not Clefable, and also like back up against things like Suicune, Rest Suicune. So, Rotom no longer having lefties is crucial because now it struggles against Jirachi. So, so does Excal's own Jirachi, so he has to get in his own Heatran. And again, Lava Plume, passive damage again. I should speed this up because we have other generations to get to. So, Clefable, there's the burn on Milotic. Passive damage, it's all about... This game is a great example of it. I recommend watching it in full if you want to learn more about how DPP works. I mean, Doug is gone now, but the principles of the Pokemon on both sides remain remain pretty much the same, just without the broken Doug aspect. Anyway, passive damage, stuff happens, Healing Wish, yeah, Clefable's hard to get worn down. Oh yeah, Excal was running Life Orb Clefable in this game, and let me actually go back a little bit. So, Life Orb Clef was better alongside Doug, but it had some great targets in being able to actually OHKO Gyarados and D-Knight with the Bolt Beam combination. And, that's big defensive utility, especially when you're running Dugtrio and giving your opponent opportunity to set those guys up, so you want to be as safe against them as you can. But at the same time, you need to... It is noticeable when you... In a situation like this, so Clef is going to switch in here and get frozen, right? And if it had lefties, it would have a much better chance at Thaw. I mean, I'm not going to blame him for getting frozen or anything, but I'm just saying that this is another example of how big passive healing is. The passive healing and damaging part of the game. I mean, you got to have a better got to have a good grasp on this if you really want to take your game to the next level. So, and I mean, the crit surf didn't help matters, but he had a better shot if he had leftovers, obviously. So, this is how crucial it is. And of course, Milotic just being passively burned, even though it has lefties, in sand, it's not going to heal unless it actively heals. I mean, just existing in sand means that Milotic never passively heals off any damage it takes. Another reason why sand is so strong. So, anyway, black and white. So, the biggest thing about black and white is that you have more spinners, you have better spinners. You have Rain Tentacruel, and you have Sand Excadrill. Excadrill doesn't really care about the sand. It's just the default option for sand. So both of them are really good. And the interaction they have for Gen 5 in particular is affecting the Weather Wars because when you're trying to struggle for winning, getting an advantage over the opponent's Weather Setter, then where do you go? You go to passive damage because what is the opponent going to let you hit Politoed with Latios' Draco Meteor? Probably not. And yeah, Latios' Draco Meteor is strong, but it's you're not just going to muscle through entire teams with it. You need to accentuate it with passive damage. I mean, think about how strong it is already, and then pair it with Rocks and Spikes, which is not hard to get with how good Ferrothorn is. So, and that's why a lot of weather teams come equipped with Spin to help preserve their Weather Setter. I mean, yeah, T-Tar and Politoed are good, but they're affected by hazards completely equally. So, if you can just wear them down, because you have more hazards than your opponent, or because you can spin and they can't, then that's a big advantage. So those are the main interactions, as well as of course Reuniclus being a massive threat because again it ignores everything in terms of passive damage. And its counters, T-Tar and super bulky steels, they are vulnerable to such passive damage. So it just outlasts them, especially because it also has an instant recovery. So there's that. And then there's a more offensive version of that in Alakazam. I mean, Alakazam runs a successful mid-game focus sash set. Nothing else can do that. And that's because it will always have that sash because of Magic Guard. unless it switches into a worry seed or something, and at that point you're just as well risking switching into an attack and have like a direct move and having that thing broken. But yeah, Zam can switch into Toxics, Will-O-Wisps, Leech Seeds, whatever, and still be at full health and still have that sash to survive that +1 Dragonite Outrage or whatever. So it's big. Poison. Oh, this is where Gliscor gets Poison Heal, of course, and becomes the unkillable menace we know it to be in the later generations. I mean, talk about longevity. I mean, it's so good that it's effectively a Magic Guard because it doesn't care about. It loves Toxic actually. It doesn't care about Will-O-Wisp, Leech Seed. I mean, Leech Seed is a temporary inconvenience. And doesn't care about spikes, doesn't care about Stealth Rock, really. I mean, it out-heals, it heals off Stealth Rock instantly. You can't have a calculation that goes, oh, it KOs Gliscor after Stealth Rock, unless you know you're hitting it on the switch, because, it switches in and Stealth Rock is gone. So, it's crazy, it has crazy longevity. Breloom is similarly annoying. I mean, it's affected by sand, but it still heals. And you really see how crazy good Poison Heal is when Breloom is in rain, because then it really doesn't die, and it's immune to Scald. Oh, Scald! This is the generation we got the worst move in the game, and being immune to Scalds and healing and in the face of it is huge. And I mean, this is how good passive damage is. I mean, half the time you don't really care that you have the attack drop. I mean, something like Rotom doesn't care that Rotom doesn't use Scald. It's an honorary Scalder because it's a water type with Will-O-Wisp. But, I mean, stuff like Jellicent or Slowking, or Latios, they don't really care about the attack drop at all. But the constantly being chipped at, that is huge. Especially considering the amount of Protect Pokemon in the metagame. And with how hard it is to deal with attacks already. I mean, like, Latios struggles to switch into Keldeo as is. If you burn Latios, you really can't switch it into Keldeo. So, and I mean, half the time Keldeo uses not half the time, but it often uses a Scald Protect set to really make dealing with it irritating. Once again, yeah, it's really strong, but passive damage, Scald, Protect, Toxic, Sword, great set, and makes it even more irritating to deal with. So, once again, passive damage everywhere. You can see these interactions based on the tier list. Again, outside resources, Discord server, other videos, etc. So let's look at how this affects this game in the SPL Finals. So there we have. Now Raze's team doesn't have a spinner, which can be annoying if Ferrothorn gets him a million spikes, but at the same time, he's got 3 spike immune Pokemon: Alakazam, Gliscor, and Latios, and a Magic Guard Pokemon and a pseudo Magic Guard, a Magic Guard Pokemon and a pseudo Magic Guard Pokemon. So, of course, that said, Caetano having Tentacruel does mean that he is able to maintain a hazard advantage, and that is big for the Weather War, considering we've got Sand versus Rain here. So, he knows he wants to get hazards up as soon as possible with Pharaoh, so he leads off with Garchomp. And so again, just the threat of passive damage is enough to get a read on how your opponent's going to play. He says, look, Raze's team is manageable without hazards, and with hazards it's really dangerous, so I punish the move that tries to get those hazards early. And so again, this is you think, oh, he just let off with a strong Pokemon and he is going to now do a massive chunk to everything. It's not that simple. Like, he has to keep in mind hazards, because it's not like Tentacruel spins for free. I mean, everything on Raze's team threatens it. So he won't, and plus spinning is reactive. He doesn't want to be forced into such a position. So the Garchomp there was, yes, it was using a strong Pokemon to KO something, but it was also very tactical. So, in the same vein as the Sakri versus Insult game. So now he gets his hazards first, and so Reza makes a good move, fast forwarded. Reza makes a good move to go to his Ferrothorn to now get his hazards, and now Caetano's hazards are permanent, so he can really, make Reza's T-Tar regret living. So now good moves to keep himself in it, but it's tough. And so, you could say Reza should have let off with Latios or something, because it threatens Trick on Caetano's Ferrothorn. But, yeah, tough to say. And here's Scald. The burn chance is huge here, but passive damage. And I mean, again, passive recovery. Tentacruel in rain is the most unkillable thing ever, and Tentacruel in sand is, gonna die instantly. So, and of course, there's Iron Barbs here as well to accentuate all that, and he gets a lucky crit. You could say the Scald Burn was lucky, though. I mean, that's why Scald is so dumb. It has such good odds. So now, no hazards, and, he's getting dug into by the Torn, harder. I mean, without Rocks and Spikes digging into it, Heatran is a really good check to Tornadus. But with Rocks and Spikes digging into it, then it's just, yeah. So you think, yeah, Caetano's got these offensive threats, but half the reason his offensive threats are so dangerous is because they are being supported with hazards. And another noticeable thing is that Alakazam in particular becomes so much less threatening when it doesn't have the opposing side of the field littered with spikes. So, once again, hazards and that second Draco... With hazards, that second Draco Meteor killed Ferrothorn. Even just Stealth Rock nullifying... Well, it might have. I'm not sure. But even with... you think, oh, come on, Ferrothorn is resistant to Stealth Rock. Yeah, and without Stealth Rock on the field, it heals when it switches into an attack. With Stealth Rock on the field, it merely nullifies Stealth Rock. So... even in these situations where you don't think it's doing much, it really is. So, Reza is getting unlucky here, but who knows at this point. So, T-Tar, U-turn, great moves by Caetano for sure. And he finishes the game off. But hazards were a big part of that, passive damage. Now we're going to go to ORAS, and we're already over an hour, so I'm going to try and speed things up. But it's pretty simple at this point anyway. So I already made the points earlier about how Defog makes it harder to wear these big threats down, Keldeo being the best example. And, you got things like Volcarona, which are so deathly afraid of passive damage. Well, the main form of passive damage that you got to go out of your way to support them, Talonflame. And, of course, now, well, Sticky Web isn't passive damage, really, so we're not going to count that. But... You got Regenerator, because Torn Therian is running loose. You got Slowbro being top tier. And you got Clefable being Clefable. So it's just, outlasting counters. I mean, even Reuniclus is good. And Spikes are very nice. So it's more the same. It's more just the lack of permanent sand is really, really crucial here in letting Keldeo... I mean, if you've ever played ORAS, Keldeo will come in a million times a game and just blast you and buffer you over and over and over and over. And it never seems to get weaker because Stealth Rock resists Pokemon without... I mean, Specs Keldeo and Sand is dangerous in Black and White, and that's why such a big part of dealing with rain is cutting off the rain as much as you can. So you have Sand digging into those Pokemon instead of having them, not getting them passively buffered by the sand and giving them a power boost instead. So it's manageable, but it's still scary. It's a Specs Keldeo, but it'll eventually die. And in ORAS, that's not really the case. So now ORAS can be very offensive, but let's take a look at how passive damage affects it here. I mean, we got Sand. Sand is still good, even for just small bursts at a time. Now Raptor's team is very hyper offense. Now hyper offense is the team that is least, across the generations. It's least about, oh, I'm gonna, make use of little bits of chip damage, and and it's definitely not focused on dishing out Toxics and Leech Seeds, but it still has to use Stealth Rock. It needs Stealth Rock, and it still has to deal with Stealth Rock. I mean, there's a pincer, so that's why Latias is there, and of course. Now we have Defog to consider, which also makes Bisharp good, makes Superior good. Great. He's using CBB's team, actually. The Pinsir, Superior, Bisharp, Azumarill offense. So, there are the rocks. Of course, there's the Excadrill to try and get rid of him, because he needs them for Volcanion. But, so now here comes the Excadrill. And when you try to remove those hazards, that's why Tank Chop is so good. Rough Skin, Rocky Helmet takes about a gajillion trying to remove it. Or it can get up its own hazards, because it's not like he immediately needs them. He's got 2 Regenerators in Tangrowth and Tornadus. So, he is switching out because he's afraid of a Scarf Latias. And now Superior comes in, great move. And, yeah, I mean, even Excadrill does show off its typing a lot when it switches into Stealth Rock and then out heals it with lefties. But even then, otherwise it would be gaining 6.25% with the lefties. And when Excadrill just tends to barely hang on with whatever hits it's taking, even something as innocuous as Clefable Moonblast, then over the course of a game, then that little bit of recovery, it makes a difference. In a faster-paced game like this, then we also see the other side of the coin, which is not as common, but yeah, sometimes passive damage isn't as crucial. But, look, he gets rid of the rocks, and now he has the freedom to switch into Torn, switch his Torn into Serp a lot more easily. He can switch in Tangrowth, and he's going to have to try to get those rocks back up again. So, now he's kind of in trouble here. But he's going fishing and doesn't get it, but now Torn, and now, rocks go up, and a lot of good moves on both sides. Healing Wish, Serp, Chomp, and Hurricane. So, Stealth Rock is actually even big in dealing with Azumarill because, suddenly it loses its Citrus Berry, or gets down to lower health more quickly. So I've been talking for an hour 15, so I'm starting to lose it. Anyway, so Knockoff getting rid of the helmet, another source of passive damage. Now he's got all that passive. Oh, I thought he had Bullet Punch. I was gonna say, well, he can't Sand because it would take 2 turns to KO, so never mind. But yeah, so now lots of passive damage everywhere. Bisharp, and yeah, so anyway, Sand was not, so in this game it wasn't as crucial, but the Stealth Rock part was still very, very pivotal. Now, finally we'll go on to Sun and Moon, and I'll make a quick mention of Gen 8, which I usually don't cover, but the thing there is that, of course, there's heavy-duty boots, which allows you to bypass hazards, which is, of course, enormous, and a lot of the metagame is, leveraging your boots, making use of your regenerator, etc. Now, Sun and Moon is mostly the same as ORAS, and we already, went over the Sun and Moon game there, or at the beginning of the game. You have more defog options now. That's the main difference. Oh, and Scald and Burn in general is weaker because it's 6.25%. So whereas before, Ferrothorn while burned, even if it still had lefties, it would still be losing health. But now a burned Ferrothorn or Toxapex will still will stay at the same health, even if burned, as long as it's holding in lefties. So passive damage everywhere. You got your Pex, you got your Heatran. An underrated aspect of trapping was, besides just, your standard hazards, leech, status, is Magma Storm. Well, it's specific because it's very rare, but, Magma Storm's trapping damage in Gen 6, 7, 8 is, huge, does an absolute ton. So, passive damage, and, there's the Gliscor. Getting its Toxic Orb off, so now it can switch into Scald all day long. There's Spikes, there's Knockoff, making sure... it's Shed Shell, not lefties, but even then. Anyway. And, yeah, so... See, even that little bit of Spikes damage, that means that Tapu Koko would very likely die to a Magma Storm. You can see, even in situations where you think, oh, it's not such a big deal, it really, really is. Even here, where Gliscor, yeah, it's going to wall the Heatran, but it's also forced to roost here. Whereas if rocks weren't up, or, then it probably would not have to. We see passive damage everywhere. We must appreciate it. Anyway, so now we see this weird Mega Latios set. Stuff happens, passive damage. Look at all the the Magic Guard Clef immune to... Well, now it doesn't pass... Oh, it has Life Orb. Anyway, point being, look at all the passive damage that Rillis has to deal with, whereas Gondra does not, so that's a major, major advantage for him. But, of course, that's the thing. He's got the Gliscor, which doesn't care. But then, of course, Gondra's got the Skarmory, so you see the matchup change that result from the interactions between passive damage and the passive damage users, of course. So... yeah, Gliscor really... Look, there's max hazards and Heatran hates it. Oh, look at how much health Heatran loses. At least it has leftovers, but look, it goes from 50 all the way down there, so... And it, gets more because it forces the Skarmory out and gets up its own rocks at least, but, the saving grace is the Reuniclus and Gliscor, which really don't care about how many layers of spikes are on the field. So... And Latios helps out a lot there too. And I mean, yeah, there's Pex and... I mean, even Pex, it doesn't like all those hazards, but it's offset by the fact that it has a regenerator. So, you know, the damage is lessened. And it has Recover too. Coco has Roost. And Heatran usually has... Oh, it does have Protect. So, you know, even though Relus's team is not deliberately anti-hazards, or then it still can... And it does have Defog form. Then it can still hang with hazards. You know, and as long as you have rocks, then you can compete with most stuff. So, anyway, this is a super long game, so we're not going to get into it more, considering we should be coming up on the end here. But Gliscor switching around, staying alive, never dying, because Gliscor is immortal. And there was a freeze somewhere. Oh yeah, Latios uses Ice Beam and freeze. I saw a thaw somewhere. Yeah. Anyway, Reuniclus being immune to passive damage is also big, because you can't just Toxic it, because it doesn't really do anything. And yeah, so, and we'll finally, you know, we already mentioned that Boots of Sword and Shield, so we'll go in this game. It's just one of the OU games between Blarg and Empo. So, you know, people hate Clef and Sword and Shield. I understand why. And this is, you know, basically, so it's everywhere. I mean, leftovers, you know, Boots on Zero Aura, and the thing about Boots, of course, is that it means you do not have the tool. You don't have leftovers. So Zero Aura is, you know, as soon as Hippo comes in, Zero Aura still takes damage because of Sand. So you get a lot of long games because of Boots. But yeah, so, and I mean, you see this with Rotom too, and you know, the Sand little, you know, affecting them, but you know, it's all generally outweighed by their immunity to rocks. So yeah, they're trading like lots of passive damage. And Pain Split, you know, Pain Split is such a cool move because it turns passive damage into a weapon that you can use. Of course, it can be used against you, as we saw in that Sakri game. Anyway, so I'm not really interested in this game, and I've already been going for a while, but yeah. Toxapex, another Pokemon whose immunity to passive damage is a big reason of why it's so tough to deal with. Clef, the Immortal, you know, Corviknight. Okay, yeah, I'm just really rambling at this point. Stuff. Okay, yeah. So yeah, that has pretty much been it. I think I've said all I've wanted to. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this was informative for you. Don't think I can say anything more at this point that wouldn't just be me repeating myself, like I haven't enough already. And my jaw is really starting to irritate me, so I'm gonna give it a rest. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this was useful for you somehow, educational, all that good stuff. And I will catch you again very, very soon.